Hello and welcome to Fidelity Connects. I'm Pamela Ritchie. With both Ontario's election and the Liberal leadership race now decided, the attention of the nation is on the upcoming spring federal election, which is all but certain. Under the threat and the reality of tariffs from the United States, Canadians are at an unfamiliar point in this nation's history. How might new federal leadership deliver policy to help steer us into a new era of Canada-US relations? Joining us here today to offer their insights into everything from tax policy to the build-out of AI, defense spending, and all things politics, happy to say our former Director of Communications to Prime Minister Stephen Harper and CEO of Rubicon Strategy, Kory Teneycke, and David Herle, who is former top advisor to Prime Minister Paul Martin and partner at Rubicon Strategy. Delighted to have you both. Thank you for being here, Kory. Thank you, David, for joining us. We'll invite everyone else to send their questions in over the next little while. I think there will be lots of them. Kory, I might start with the discussion of the Ontario election, which you ran essentially for Doug Ford. Congrats. That worked very well. Any sort of quick lessons of an election under tariff threats from Trump? Like, what was successful and useful?
Well, that topic basically swept the table clean of every other issue. It became, the centerpiece. Certainly affordability was on the table a bit, but kind of in relationship to the Trump tariffs and the amount of economic disruption that potentially would hold for the Ontario economy and Canadian economy. So I think it's become the elephant in the room, right? Like, this is the one defining issue that's animating the electorate and causing people to switch who their voting intention is for. That said, it presents some big challenges for opposition parties because this fight is happening in real time during a campaign.
Right.
So should the federal election be called this Sunday, which is my guess anyway as to when it'll be, you're going into another round of bare knuckle trade war battles with the president of the United States and Lutnick and others. And so what does that look like? Well, it's a fight between the prime minister and the president, and the opposition leader is not really a huge party to what's going on and what's driving news. So if you're in Washington, as Ford was a couple times during the campaign,
right,
very difficult for the opposition leaders to get any share of voice. In many respects, we were running a campaign against Trump, not against Bonnie Crombie or Marit Stiles. And I think it's quite possible to see a similar dynamic happening at the federal level.
David, let's put that to you and to some of your thoughts on what we've seen over the last few days and really where we go from here. Just open it up for us.
Well, I think, what Kory just described is obviously why Liberals overwhelmingly chose Mark Carney as leader, because Carney was seen as the person who was most qualified to manage Canada through this extraordinary situation. He has an extraordinary CV and resume and history, and it is ideally suited, if you will, in a number of respects for this circumstance. And so that is going to be what the campaign is about. The Conservatives appear to be struggling with that reality a little bit. They continue to want the election to be about the things it was going to be about before Mr. Trump arrived, which is getting rid of a long-term government and getting rid of things like the carbon tax that were irritating people. But it's pretty clear that those are not going to be the driving forces of the election for most Canadians. And the real issue now, in terms of this election, in my view, because I think Carney is now the front runner, because I think he owns this issue. And I think the Conservatives and Poilievre have to find a way to make Canadians believe that Canada would be in as safe a hands with Mr. Poilievre. And it's not just Canada's economy or Canada's response to the tariff threats. It is Canada. And Canadian people believe that Canada is existentially threatened and challenged right now. It has created a wave of nationalism like I have never seen before, and in part never seen before because it fully includes the province of Quebec, which normally keeps its enthusiasm for Canada wrapped up a little bit. But in this case, they are a full participant So that's what this election is going to be about.
Okay.
Mr. Poilievre, I think right now has positioned himself as somebody that sees more things wrong with Canada than right with it. And people agreed with him 6 months ago, and they don't agree now. Timing is everything.
Timing's everything. Will this be, Kory, a battle between two individuals? Will we see more of the party? I mean, the leaders will always be the leaders, and that will be the main debate platform and so on. But you sort of get a sense of, we keep talking or hearing about there's going to be a new cabinet, new people, new faces for the Liberal Party. We're not hearing a lot about the team on that side for the Conservatives. Will that change?
I'm not sure there's a lot of time to have that change.
Okay.
I think insofar as Poilievre can find someone else to be the attack dog for his party, he would be wise to do so. And there aren't a lot of options there. I think someone like a Melissa Lantsman would be a good option for them. But it's hard to be likable when you're saying really negative things all the time, and when you're being the face of your attack narrative. If you go back to Harper's time in office, Poilievre was Harper's attack dog. He was the guy who would throw the haymakers, sometimes bear. There were other people who would front the more negative storyline that you have to tell in politics. But Poilievre's very practiced at that. He's very experienced in being the attack dog. The downside is it makes you very unlikable. And I think in the context of a fight with Donald Trump, some of that can look very Trumpian. And so when you're in this context of who's going to stand up for Canada and against Donald Trump, I think the line that Carney used in his speech was some version of it's you're not going to stand up against Trump if you're on your knees at the altar of Trump.
It was evocative, that particular comment. Yes.
But some version of that. But I think that's a point that they're trying to make in their advertising, and it's one that Poilievre has to wiggle out from under so he doesn't get pinned down. And it's hard to do that if you keep matching Trump's tone. If you're talking about your big, beautiful take-it-home tax cut, or talking about sneaky Mark Carney who's trying to weasel his way out of the Liberal record.
Those are the ads, though.
Those sound like Trump, and I think that is a problem for Poilievre today, and I think it's something that they're going to have to adjust for.
Okay, David, let's talk about the money that's in the coffer for each of the parties. The Conservatives level vastly out. Is far larger. Is there time for the Liberals to make that up? And to what extent does it matter, ultimately, in this particular campaign, which sounds like it's going to be very quick?
Well, it matters much less if it's quick. And so the Conservatives have an enormous financial advantage, and that matters a lot. Kory and I talk about this a lot on The Curse of Politics, which is your podcast. Which is my podcast, yes. My podcast, our podcast. Yeah. And the truth is that you cannot deliver your messages through earned media anymore effectively. Mm-hmm. There are not enough people consuming newspapers and television news for you to use those things reliably to get your message out. So if you're going to communicate with Canadians now, you need to pay to do it, whether it's online or on television or wherever it is. You need to pay to do it, to get your ideas in front of them. And Conservatives have vastly more money than the Liberals. There's no chance the Liberals could make that up. And so as long as we're not in a writ period and there's no restriction on money, that's a massive advantage for the Conservatives. Okay. As soon as you get into an election campaign, there are constraints on what you can spend. They apply to each party, and the Liberals will have no trouble spending the maximum. So they move on to an equal financial footing with the Conservatives as soon as an election is called. That's one argument for doing it as quickly as possible, because every day you do it is another day without that massive buy of Conservative negative ads that you were talking about. This has been an untold part of the story all the way along, because the Conservatives have been advertising consistently for about a year and a half, and it played a fair role in destroying Mr. Trudeau's reputation.
Yeah, interesting. Do you want to just add to that before I move on? Yeah, I mean, it's a mountain of money in comparison. So,
well, I think in the fullness of time, irrespective of what an outcome of an election campaign is going to be, I think the Conservatives overdid it in the pre-writ, and they were so effective in the absolute fire hose of attack ads that was coming at Trudeau that they made him completely unelectorally viable to the point where he left. And all of the brand equity they'd created in that narrative and, framing the election as Poilievre versus Trudeau, well, you kind of, maybe you don't have to start from scratch, but you've reduced the building to its foundation maybe. And there's a lot of work to do to build up a new narrative and stand that up because you've lost the antagonist in your storyline. Yeah. So I think, they maybe overdid it. And because the result was, despite Trudeau really, really wanting to run again, he was not in a position to do so. The party would not accept it.
I'll ask this to both of you. David, surely there was a plan or an algorithm, a scenario that was drawn up for if Trudeau as a punching bag for Poilievre was removed or, left, that there would be a next sort of plan B for whoever came in. It doesn't seem like there is yet, or not an effective one. It is one being drafted right now. Do you get the sense they're moving closer to being able to attack Mr. Carney in effective ways?
Well, the deus ex machina in all this was Trump. Yeah. Because if Trump didn't exist and the Liberals had just replaced Trudeau with Carney, I think the Conservatives were looking forward to that matchup. Because I think they thought that Carney was an elitist, international person, great education, knew all the important people in the world, exactly the kind of person you'd want to run against in a populist era, a representative of the establishment at a time when the establishment is in great disrepute. And so I think that they were licking their chops. But Trump changed what people are looking for in a leader. And so Poilievre has positioned himself ever since entering the leadership of the Conservative Party as a disruptor, as a person that would come in and start to dismantle things in Canada that were, in his view, irresponsible spending or pointlessly divisive in any number of things. So he was going to cancel the CBC, he was going to cancel the carbon, he was going to do all kinds of things, but he was a disruptor. The status quo was lousy, was broken, and he was going to disrupt it. But we now have the ultimate disruptor in Trump, and Canadians have decided he's a threat, a real threat existentially to the country. So they're not looking for a Canadian prime minister to come in and break things. They're looking for a Canadian prime minister with safe hands for the country. And Mr. Poilievre, I'm not saying he can't be that, but that's not what he's positioned himself as. That's not how he sold himself. And so that is now the threat. And that is why they're not ready for Carney and in terms of their attack ads, because in this context, they don't know how to attack him.
All right. Okay. Do you want to add to that? I mean, I
agree with every word of that. That's sort of what's going on.
That's what's going on.
But this element of sort of nationalism or patriotism that has been like a groundswell in reaction to Trump, some of those disruptive things that Poilievre has put on the table are in the wrong. They're in the wrong key for what the music that people want to hear right now, and so which parts of that do you roll back? And then there are other parts of it that have been taken off the table by the Liberals, which were very much what people wanted to hear, like getting rid of the carbon tax, as we've talked about on this panel before, the capital gains tax changes. So some of these irritants for large portions of the electorate are being removed from the conversation. So that's not great. Trudeau has been removed from the conversation. That's not great for them. And in its place is Trump, who is like a wrecking ball. And there's enough wrecking going on without doing more of it on this side of the border, I guess, is kind of what David's getting at there, and I think it's largely true.
And what about this sort of? It feels like a move to the center, and maybe a moment to leave, far right and left off a bit because you don't have time. There's a lack of time for that sort of. I don't know if indulgence is the right word, but distraction away from sitting in the middle. David, would you, we are also hearing that Mark Carney, we don't know what his cabinet's going to be like, but you're hearing that there could even be people who aren't typically liberal, who, it would be ruling from the center in the way they always do at some point, but in a new way. How is that helping, David?
Well, I think that one of the things that Mr. Carney brings, even in a non-Trump context, is deep expertise in the economy. I think if there was anything that Canadians could agree on about the Trudeau government, and Mr. Trudeau personally, is that he wasn't interested enough and or expert enough in the economy to run it well. And he didn't pay enough attention to it, paid more attention on spending the proceeds of it than on creating those proceeds. And I think Canadians were really ready for a change in that regard. Mr. Carney does represent a change in that regard. I don't think he's a right-winger, but what he's made absolutely clear is that the economy is his number one focus, and that he is going to build up the Canadian economy so that it doesn't matter how the United States treats us in tariff terms, because we have other arrangements, we have others, things we're producing and we're selling them to other people. It's a pretty ambitious goal. I'm not saying that's going to be achieved, but that's the promise he represents.
Well, this is really the key. Sorry, David.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this is really the key, that no one is going to get a deal with Trump. I think this is increasingly obvious, and because the objective is not to position or to negotiate for a revised USMCA agreement. That all indications publicly and privately for those of us with some line of sight into that, it's not that. It's 51st state. It is constant disruption in terms of what the investment environment will look like north of the border. Will we have tariffs? Oh no, a month for reprieve. Oh no, another month. But
everything grinds to a halt.
But the threat is like an ice storm. It's freezing all potential investments. It's calling all of that into question, and the net result of it is making Canadians poorer, devaluing our dollar. All of these things. I think are by design, and it's not by design to try to get a better agreement. It's by design to weaken us, and some form of economic conquest is as unlikely as that is. And I would say next to impossible. But that is the mentality that you're facing off against across the table. So I think it's who can do the most to actually insulate the Canadian economy from this, to buttress it in other ways, whether it's diversifying trade, whether it's making the investment environment here in Canada better, independent of what the U.S. is doing. So whether it's internal free trade agreements, all of that.
I want to ask you about tax policy.
What can we do in Canada as Canadians, absent the disruption being caused by the United States, to improve our economic situation here? And I think that's the order of the day. I think that's what people are going to have to focus on. As insofar as Trump might prefer to have a Polyev government, that's bad for Polyev, right? That's the kiss of death. Every time Elon Musk sends out a tweet saying how much he likes Polyev, Polyev goes down a point. You don't want to be the preferred leader for Vichy Canada, right? It's not the ballot question that Canadians are looking for right now.
That's right. He's like, shh, please stop. Very interesting. In Mark Carney's response, David, in part of his speech, he was talking a little bit about spending, and that seemed to counter what we'd heard from Polyev of it should go straight to tax cuts. Carney spoke a little bit, although he wasn't very specific, about spending would go to industries affected by tariffs, to job losses, essentially. To what extent, let's talk a little bit about maybe tax policy, maybe about fiscal spending. Do you think might be, I'm not asking you what's needed, but what might be palatable within this election campaign that we are on the eve of?
Well, so Carney has already promised a middle-class tax cut. He hasn't put any detail around that, but he's promised a middle-class tax cut that will deliver at least as much to homes as the carbon tax rebate did, to avoid the
interestingly, yes,
to avoid the frankly negative consequences for many households of losing the rebate. I mean, this is against conventional wisdom in Canada, but many people made money off that rebate, spent less on the carbon tax than they got in rebate, and so there's going to be a net loss to those families, and he's promised to make it up with a middle-class tax cut. The other innovation that he's proposed to bring is to change the way we account for spending, and to have a bucket that is for consumption, and everything from paying interest on the debt to transfers to provinces for health care to the dental care program would be in that bucket. And then there'd be a bucket for economic investments, productivity investments. And what he's promised is that he would balance the operating budget and deliberately did not promise to balance the investment budget.
It's like a capital budget.
Canada needs big investments if it is going to modernize its economy to deal with this threat. And a lot of that's going to have to be stimulated by the public sector. And he's proposing to spend large amounts of money on productive investments in the economy. Now, skeptics will say that there's always the devil in the definitions of those things. And that's a fair comment. But Carney's plan to insulate people from the effects of Trump are largely the middle-class tax cut and the fact that all revenue taken from our own tariffs that we put in place retaliatory to Trump will go back to support the industries and the workers in those industries.
Which is a different message. Is there something else that Pierre Poilievre might want to consider there? I mean, it's interesting. Okay, let's talk about that first, and I'll ask you about this sort of tax policy.
Well, I think there will be a lot of eyes on what is Poilievre going to do around the investments that the Liberal government has made with the province of Ontario in particular around auto manufacturing and battery manufacturing. Like, what is that going to stay, or is that going to go? Where is the government on, or where would a Poilievre government be on like things like ITCs for, the rebuilding of the nuclear industry and the energy industry to position it towards, AI and data centers and all of that. Those are big questions.
Big questions. How do you plug in our type of energy into something?
So, if you look at the support that the Ford government got from construction unions, et cetera. It's a lot of it is related to those kinds of things. It's you are going to be doing the big build out of highways and transit system and nuclear fleet and auto sector. That's where those jobs are for those people. So are you committed to that or are you not? And and if we're going to see massive disruptions as a result of Trump in some of those sectors like autos, like what's your plan? Are those people just SOL, or are they going to get transitioned into something else? And if so, what is that, and how realistic is it? So, like I think there'll be more focus on the Conservative platform in this election than might otherwise be the case, because I think a lot of eyes are going to be on those things.
Like, how are we fixing the job losses related or impacts ultimately from tariffs? David, jump in there.
Well, I think that Ontario and the federal government are likely to be in a lot of synchronicity in their thinking about this, or at least the Carney government is. Don't know about the Poilievre government. I think where the Carney government is going to face confederation issues is with the two prairie provinces, because Trump's tariff plan illustrates his vulnerability. So the tariff on energy is only 10%. And the tariff on potash is only 10%.
Right.
And if listeners don't understand, Canada provides virtually all of the fertilizer, that's potash, for American farmers. And the only other source
unless there's a deal in Ukraine, they can take it from Russia and Belarus again. But yes.
That's right. And so Trump has essentially exempted these from his 25% tariffs and put only 10% tariffs on us. What does that tell us? He doesn't want 25% tariffs on there because he'll get a bad reaction from his voters. That means we should be doing exactly that. That means we should be raising the price of those commodities until he and his constituents feel that pain. But that will be vigorously and vociferously opposed by the premiers of those two provinces, and is in anticipation being vigorously opposed. And that will be keeping the country united through that exercise is going to be one of the trickiest things the Prime Minister will face.
That's really interesting. What of Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party in Ottawa on exactly that question? Because we just don't hear about it a lot.
Well, I don't think they're anxious to talk about it at the moment, but I would see it as one of the biggest reasons to actually elect Pierre Poilievre to deal with this situation. I think that he has a much greater amount of latitude to with the electorate in Saskatchewan and Alberta to bring them along as a part of a unified Canadian approach or response to this tariff fight, this trade war. I think he's got a much stronger hand to play there because his electorate overlaps so much with Scott Moe's voters and with Danielle Smith's voters. I think, any action on those kinds of areas by a Carney government could look a lot like a new national energy program. It could be something that literally tears the country in half. So, it's not that Poilievre doesn't have cards that I think he can play to position him well in this fight. It's just it's a tough card to roll out before you're prime minister. You're going to be telling part of your electoral coalition that there's some pain in the future for them as a part of a unified response.
That's fascinating. Okay, that's a really interesting point. I'll put this to each of you. Actually, we spoke with David McNaughton, former ambassador to the U.S., last week, and one of the things that he said, and this was everything's happened in the last 48 hours, 72 hours. He said one idea is just to kick the trade conversations down the road as long as possible and focus more on defense, because there's sort of some traction there. It's an area that might bring everyone to the table in a way that's more easily to get other things bridged. David, let's start with you on that. What do you think about the sort of trade talks? Yes, but maybe kicking it down the road a bit. I don't know if it's possible.
Well, it may make sense, although it's not really up to Canada to kick it down the road. It's the president who has a different attack on us every single day. Today, he's doubled the tariffs on steel and uranium to 50%
aluminum
as a result of Ontario's action on electricity, he says. We'll see if that comes to pass. But it's a little hard to put that conversation away when he keeps raising it every single day. With regard to defense, it makes a lot of sense. I think Canadians are now agreed in large measure that we need to take more responsibility for our own defense. Not because the United States is asking us to, but because we can no longer trust the United States. And so I think that there's a consensus around doing that. But on the other hand, in the current context, I think there is significant resistance to investing all of that defense money in American technology and in American defense contractors. And in fact, there's a sense that, given the approach the United States is taking to us, that we should buy that equipment elsewhere. And I don't know how practicable that is in a certain time frame, but it also feels like it would not dampen the animosity with the United States, but possibly exacerbate it.
Yeah. Thoughts on that? I mean, that does sound. There's that argument that a lot of the NATO grumbling is that you would buy more arms from the U.S. and that was part of the agreement of the entire thing. So it was what held it together. But
like NATO, for all intents and purposes, is dead. Is like
right.
An alliance is not just like a paper document. It's predicated on a shared belief that if you're called upon to defend one of the member countries, that you'll actually show up and do that.
And you'll not attack one of the member countries.
We've kind of seen the opposite signals. We've seen the president talk about countries he will not, step in to defend, whether it's the Baltic states or elsewhere. I think that the fundamental, agreement that is NATO, is being eroded to the point of it being of very little value, as long as Trump is around. So, he's taking a more regional view of the world, which is why he's talking about Greenland and Panama and, renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. It's very Monroe Doctrine,
Yes.
19th century view of zones of control and influence. And in that context, a greater role for the Canadian military, I think, in Trump's mind, is to protect the northern flank, right? What are you doing to actually patrol under the ice, to listen for enemy submarines? What are you doing to, provide air defense and early warning radars and all of that in the north? I think we've got to do all of that. But I agree with David that I'm not sure the Americans are creating a great incentive structure for us to be buying American equipment to do that. Yet I think that is part and parcel what the Americans want. So, I'm not sure it's the easy fix that some would like it to be.
Yeah. David, what do you think ultimately about the time for us to build these things? It would take a long time. We'd have to procure them somewhere else, like across the globe, somewhere else, I guess, just not from the U.S. What is the sort of timing issue around that?
Well, the timing issue around defense, everybody in Canada has up until this point like right up until this day, taken a fairly lackadaisical approach about getting our defense spending up to what is the international norm. And so talked about doing that by 2027 or by 2030 in different cases. And I think it probably needs to start ramping up almost immediately. There are, I think, European options for military equipment that would suit our purposes, especially if we're going to be allied with Europe more in the long term than we are with the United States. But timing for everything is, I think Poilievre is right when he says that in a lot of respects, the Liberals are coming into alignment with things he talked about leading up to this. And one of them is underlying Carney's "it's time to build" is his argument that we're going to have to build things way faster than we've been building them. And that means looking at all the approvals and compliance issues that are involved in getting things built in Canada. It also means looking at literally how quickly we build them. And because whether it is defense equipment or whether it's making the Port of Churchill a true international port,
right,
or any of those kinds of big infrastructure projects, Trump has put us in a position of kind of now or never. We don't have 10 years to figure this out.
Yeah. I mean, let's go with ports just to begin with. How many new ports do you think? I mean, there's been discussions about where they might go, and some of them are already there, obviously need to be bolstered. But we're looking at significantly more ports, we think, over the next 10 years?
Yep. Well, probably need more LNG. You probably, if we don't like selling our energy resources in Western Canada at a discount to the United States, we need more pipelines. We need more infrastructure to export to other markets, like across the board. If we're not going to sell all the potash to the United States, well, there's a port implication to that too. So there's a lot that needs to be done across the board on all of this, and the Canadian approach of 10 years to a maybe on resource development doesn't work. We like to brag about having all the critical minerals that the world needs. But a lot of good that does us if they're in the ground.
Yes.
Like we're not developing any of them right now.
Like it's like just a completely beside the point statement to be making. So things like the Ring of Fire, I think you're going to see.
That's going to be fast tracked pretty quickly, don't you think?
I think so. But to David's point, I think you're seeing the Liberal government come to the Poilievre position. I think C-69, the Impact Assessment Act around these sorts of projects, the Supreme Court's largely gutted it already, but I think Parliament needs to finish the job. I think it needs to go away 100%. And I think on the provincial level, the provinces are going to have to speed up their processes massively. Yeah. And I think you're going to see that.
And David, does this come with some version of a caveat, or how it's structured ultimately with more Canadian ownership somehow? I mean, I don't know how that works exactly, or whether we've got what it takes, but it sounds like the development of some of the things that we need to develop lickety split would have to be more Canadian based, wouldn't it?
Oh, well, likely, because
are we going to say yes to international deals in the way that we have in the past? I guess that's the question.
Well, I think we're going to be suspicious about who's doing it. And, two of the major people that would want to do it we're most suspicious of, the United States and China. So, yeah, I think that does imply more Canadian involvement. And I guess one of the things I would look for is something that the Canadian government's been kicking around for a couple of years, which is how do you get the Canadian pension funds involved in investing in Canada? And I certainly want to go on the record as saying I am dead set against any political direction of pension fund investing. So it would have to be investments that genuinely made sense on behalf of the beneficiaries of those pension funds. But we have massive pools of capital in Canada, controlled in Canada, that could be deployed theoretically to finance investment in Canada.
Yeah.
But that comes to the point we need to change the investment environment here in Canada to be more competitive.
Yes.
Capital will flow wherever it's going to make the most money. Sure. And sadly, our investment environment here, for some of the reasons that we talked about before, has been lacking. So what is it that we're going to do to fix that? I think is going to be another big question for governments across the board.
I mean, it's interesting with sort of the global price, or even something like potash, right? I mean, it's priced on the global markets. There's a global price for it. Yes, most Canadian goes to the U.S., but if you look at the global price for anything, any of the critical minerals, but also, copper, zinc, all of them, which are critical minerals, they are international prices, but if they're sort of being built by Canadians for Canadians, there's just a lot of rejigging that would go on, or to be sold, maybe not just on the open market. It'll be interesting to see how those deals get done.
Well, I think there's going to be increasingly a element of who you sell to as a part of any of these agreements,
sure.
right? Like so.
Well, LNG is already like that, right? You got to lock up the 30-year contract with South Korea or something.
Look at the U.S. Department of Defense, which is actually being an investor in a number of critical mineral projects here in Canada, to guarantee supply for critical minerals that they need for the defense industry. So. I think if you're going to look at areas where we have leverage on the United States in this trade fight, yes, it's potash, not a critical mineral, but an important one. Yeah. But it is things like high-grade nickel, and should the government be stockpiling that as leverage in this negotiation, and force the United States to say, okay, well, we're going to move our supply chain to China, and try to explain to the American people why that makes sense. And so I think who you sell to is going to be leverage. Critical minerals and energy are the new currency. They are globally in terms of power, in the way that oil would have been, in the preceding 100 years.
It's the international complexity of this.
Oh, yeah.
That Carney is playing off of when he says, I know how the world works.
Yeah, interesting. Because I guess you'd have to start somewhere with rejigging some of that stuff. And the implications on, do we have enough demand? If we're making it here and selling it here, you'd have to really... Anyway, yes. Someone will run those numbers, not I, but that seems like a fairly large question. I wanted to ask a little bit about, NAFTA, CUSMA, USMCA, whatever we want to call it, a partner in Mexico, in the way that we have for decades and decades had a partnership with Mexico for lots of different reasons, in many situations selling into the U.S. from either side. Just tell us a little bit about that. Okay, so it seems like there's a little bit of a rip-up of this trade agreement because we don't really know that it exists properly anymore when you have tariffs flying all over the place. What of Canada and Mexico going forward? I'll begin with you,
Cory. How is that going to work? It's very difficult to imagine that. A lot of these things are moving by land, and they're moving through the United States. And so if they're getting pounded with tariffs in that middle piece of real estate, how is that working? We're not really...
Don't stop the train. Just keep going.
We're not really shipping a lot of things by sea to Mexico and then by sea back to Canada, right? Or, it's these things are moving on trucks and trains. And so I just don't see much of a trading relationship as it existed under NAFTA, absent participation of the United States.
Yeah.
How would that work? It's very unclear to me.
They're always going to be probably our largest trading partner, so that will always be the case. It's just the rejigging of it all. David, any thoughts just on Mexico's role in this? We've seen their president be very bold in some of her discussions and decisions and messages, and also getting on board with the Trump administration in the areas where she can in terms of drug enforcement. But yeah, your thoughts on sort of Canada and Mexico relations?
Well, I don't know what the relations are like, because a lot of Canadian politicians were pretty quick to throw Mexico under the bus.
Yes, somewhere.
When these Trump tariffs were first threatened. Assuming that in a rational world, if you were concerned about the border, or if you were concerned about being flooded with low-cost Chinese imports, you would be looking at Mexico, not Canada. And so we thought we could probably exempt ourselves from that, but Trump has his own designs on Canada. I'm not an expert, and I don't personally know what the potential linkages economically between Mexico and Canada are, frankly, but it does appear that most people are looking further afield for Canadian opportunities, and focusing primarily on energy and minerals to Europe, and then, frankly, revisiting what kind of relationship we want to have with China.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, pick that one up, because that got really just absolutely dampened for lots of different reasons, but it did.
Well, this is the absurdity of Trump's approach across the board on this, where he is attacking allies and friends and neighbors in a way that I think is against the American strategic interest in favor of China and Russia. It is nuts. Like should be trying to, if you're looking at the world in a more regional sense, having a group of countries that are competing against China and Asia for AI, for EV manufacturing, for supply chains, and that we should be working together as a team in opposition to them. But what they're ultimately doing is they're pushing Canada and Europe into a position where they must do more with China to protect themselves from America. It is the exact opposite of what is, in my view, the U.S. national interest.
But if we sort of draw
if he destroys our auto industry, which he's promising to do, if he destroys our auto industry, why wouldn't we buy Chinese cars?
That's exactly correct.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and you have to assume that if we zoom out, that the relationship will still be there. It's being rejigged. It's evolving. It's changing, but it's not going to go away for the very least geographical reasons. I mean, it's easier to ship things across there. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about a couple of things that you noticed about the leaders to kind of wrap things up. I am just going to take a look at some of the questions. We don't have a ton of questions coming in right now. Let's go with the leaders. What do you expect to see over the next little while in terms of perhaps a new cabinet in the Liberals and responses and jumping off points for Poilievre? We haven't even talked about the NDP, the Bloc.
What NDP?
We haven't even talked about it. All right, maybe that's the comment.
Well, look, this is another thing that is playing well, I think, for the Liberals and creates a challenge for the Conservatives. If you look at the vote splits, they're not great right now because of the weakness of the NDP. But not great for the Conservatives. You can win a majority government with like 38% of the vote in 2011 as a Conservative, but that's because you have this perfect vote split with NDP and the Liberals. When the NDP are very low and that support has gone to the Liberals, those vote splits are terrible for Conservatives, and so. I think trying to put some air in the tires of Jagmeet Singh has got to be priority number 1 and 2 for the Conservatives when it comes to what do they actually need strategically to have a better electoral outcome. The problem is that the NDP have been so useless and Singh has been so weak that I'm not sure they would do anything with it that would be useful. Okay, really interesting. So they need to lean over and perhaps get some help there. David, what do you think is sort of next steps in terms of announcements? We're at the starting gates, it looks like. What do we see over the next few days, do you think, or that has to kind of come together?
Well, I don't know, but if I was Carney, I would take advantage of being prime minister for as long as I could without recalling the House. There is no merit to recalling the House for him. But I think one of the things that's standing him in good stead is that he looks more like the prime minister in this current circumstance than Pierre Poilievre does. Doug Ford made exceptional use of incumbency in the Ontario election campaign, going down to Washington, keeping that issue front and center, making sure that he was seen as at the center of it and part of it. I would do very similar things if I was Carney. He's going to meet with the premiers. That's wise. He should have some international conversations while he's prime minister before he lunges into the campaign. I think you'll probably see two cabinets that are very different out of Mr. Carney. I think you've got a status quo cabinet that you'll get this week, which is going to have all the key players on Canada-US left in their positions, and probably other people left largely in their positions. And I think he's hoping that after the election, he'll have more construction material to work with and can put together a different cabinet that more reflects his own priorities.
So when we hear this discussion of, people might be parachuted in who don't have seats, I mean, Carney doesn't have a seat, but there might be more of that being announced in the days to come. Is that a bit premature?
Well, the government is largely disassembled once the campaign starts.
Okay.
I'm not sure that it matters a lot. There's still a cabinet that exists, but it's in caretaker mode, and so it's less important. But I largely agree with what David just said. I think you can't make a cabinet look that different when you've got the same pieces to work with to build it, and it's not like anyone's caucus is a meeting of the Mensa Club. You've got only so much to work with.
That's great. One thing that's been fascinating to you, David, and I'll ask you, Kory, what's been, these are fascinating times. We are living through some of the most interesting political times of our life, for sure. What was one thing you would sort of pull on that has surprised you deeply and that you'd like to share a bit?
Well, yeah, you used interesting times, and I presume you used it in the Chinese way, because it's interesting in a very, very dangerous. It's interesting in a very, very dangerous way. Listen, I think that the change in sentiment about federal politics is as dramatic a change as either Kory or I will ever have seen in Canadian politics, because this election was so over and so done with. And the emergence of Trump has completely changed the criteria on which people are selecting that prime minister. And so it's now a highly competitive race. And we're going to have a race between two very distinct offerings, right? Mark Carney is the best exemplar of the establishment and the system that Canada can offer. And so to the extent that one believes in all these things, multilateral organizations, international arrangements and agreements, collaboration, nobody better than him to do that. But on the other hand, Canadians are in a very populist mood, not a lot different from that in the United States, rejecting the consensus around establishments and institutions. And so you're really going to have a pretty compelling choice between somebody who draws his strength from what he hears at the rally in the working town of northern British Columbia in Pierre Poilievre, and somebody that knows what his conversation was like with Prime Minister Macron.
Yeah. Okay. We'll leave it there. That is a stark contrast. Just a quick note.
No, I agree with that. I'm in full agreement with David on that one.
That's so uninteresting. Are you really in full agreement the whole way through? David Herle, Kory Teneycke, delighted to have you here. Thank you for pointing us in the right direction of what we need to watch and your great strategic thoughts. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Fidelity Connects podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to Fidelity Connects on your podcast platform of choice. And if you like what you're hearing, leave a review or a 5-star rating. Fidelity mutual funds and ETFs are available by working with a financial advisor or through an online brokerage account. Visit fidelity.ca/howtobuy for more information. On fidelity.ca, you can also find more information on future live webcasts, and don't forget to follow Fidelity Canada on X. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the participants and not necessarily reflect those of Fidelity Investments Canada ULC or its affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment, tax, or legal advice. It is not an offer to sell or buy, or an endorsement, recommendation, or sponsorship of any entity or security cited. Read a fund's prospectus before investing. Funds are not guaranteed, their values change frequently, and past performance may not be repeated. Fees, expenses, and commissions are all associated with fund investments. Thanks again, and see you next time.